Welcome back to Shockingly True World War II, where we tell you the most bizarre but true stories from the Second World War. Alright, so picture this scenario for a second. You're a crew member on a B-29 bomber in August 1945. Your commanding officer tells you you're going on an important mission. You've been training for weeks. They say the weapon you're carrying is special, maybe even powerful enough to end the war. But here's the thing. You've heard claims like that before, so you take off. You fly for hours over the Pacific. You drop your payload over a Japanese city. And then you see it. This massive mushroom cloud that literally swallows an entire city whole. And that's the moment it hits you. You just changed the course of human history forever, and nobody even told you what you were actually carrying. This isn't fiction. This actually happened to most of the crew aboard the Enola Gay on August 6, 1945. And this story is absolutely wild. So, here's the part that's going to blow your mind. When the Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island carrying the atomic bomb headed for Hiroshima, most of the 12 men on board had no idea they were about to drop the world's first nuclear weapon used in combat. Let me say that again because it's kind of hard to believe. The crew flying the mission, they knew they had a really powerful bomb. They knew it was top secret. They knew it was important. But most of them didn't know the full story. How is that even possible? How do you not tell people they're about to change world history? Well, that's the whole thing about the Manhattan Project. Secrecy wasn't just important. It was absolutely everything. The Manhattan Project was one of the biggest secret operations in human history. We're talking about over 130,000 people working across multiple locations. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford, in Washington, Los Alamos, in New Mexico. And here's what's crazy. Most of those 130,000 people had no clue what they were actually building. The whole thing cost about $2 billion back in the 1940s. In today's money, that's over $25 billion. Absolutely massive. And check out this insane fact. Vice President Harry Truman didn't even know the Manhattan Project existed. He had no idea until he suddenly became president in April 1945 after FDR died. Imagine that. Your first day in the Oval Office, and someone sits you down like, oh, hey, by the way, we've been secretly building a weapon that uses the power of the atom itself. Talk about a rough first day at work. The project was run by two very different guys. On the military side, you had Army General Leslie Groves. This guy was all business, no nonsense. On the science side was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist who gathered some of the greatest scientific minds on the planet. People like Enrico, Fermi, Niels Bohr, Leo Szilard. These were absolute legends in physics, all hidden away in the New Mexico desert, trying to split atoms and turn that into a weapon. Why all the secrecy and rush? Because everyone was terrified that Nazi Germany might build an atomic bomb first. That was the nightmare scenario keeping everyone up at night. The way they kept things secret was through something called compartmentalization. Workers at Oak Ridge were enriching uranium, but if you asked them what they were doing, they'd basically shrug. They were told, make this material, and that was it. No explanations. Can you imagine showing up to work every day with literally no idea what you're contributing to? In July 1945, they finally had a working bomb to test. The Trinity test happened on July 16th in the New Mexico desert, and it was the first ever nuclear explosion in history. The blast was more powerful than 20,000 tons of TNT. It literally turned night into day in an instant. When Oppenheimer watched that mushroom cloud rise up into the sky, he thought of a line from Hindu scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Pretty heavy, right? But here's something that's absolutely wild. Some of the Manhattan Project scientists had actually worried, legitimately worried, that the explosion might ignite Earth's atmosphere, and destroy all life on the planet. Oppenheimer calculated the odds were near zero. General Groves apparently responded, "Zero would be nice." I mean, think about that. They were doing an experiment where there was even a tiny chance they could accidentally end the world. That's the kind of pressure these guys were under. So the bomb worked. Now President Truman had to make one of the hardest decisions any leader has ever faced. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. But Japan was still fighting, and they were fighting hard. American forces had suffered terrible casualties, taking islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And Japan's military leaders were showing absolutely no signs of wanting to surrender. The US military had already drawn up plans for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland. The estimated casualties were horrifying, potentially hundreds of thousands of American soldiers dead. Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, would have been even worse. Some estimates went as high as 1 million total deaths. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Allies demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally. They warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japan's response? Silence. They didn't surrender. So Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima was chosen as the primary target because it was an important military and industrial city that hadn't been heavily bombed yet. It would show the full destructive power of this new weapon. Now let's talk about the men who would actually fly the mission. The job went to the 509th Composite Group, led by a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel named Paul Tibbets. Tibbets was supremely confident, some might say cocky, and he handpicked a crew of 12 men for this top-secret assignment. He also named the B-29 bomber the Enola Gay after his mother. Yeah, his mom. Kind of a sweet gesture, except, the plane was about to drop the most destructive weapon ever created. The 509th had been training for months in complete secrecy. They practiced with dummy bombs, rehearsing the technique of dropping the payload, and then immediately diving away as fast as humanly possible. The briefing was specific. Get at least 11.5 miles away within 43 seconds to avoid the shock wave. But here's the thing that makes this story so shocking. Most of the crew didn't actually know what they were carrying. They knew it was a special bomb. They'd been told it was, powerful, and might help end the war. But the actual nature of an atomic weapon, the fact that this thing used nuclear fission and would release the power of the sun itself, that was need-to-know information. And most of them didn't need to know. On August 5th, 1945, the Little Boy bomb was loaded into the Enola Gay's bomb bay. And by the way, Little Boy was 12 feet long and weighed 9,000 pounds. Not exactly little. The whole loading process was done under armed guard. Officers even threw a tarp over the bomb, like that would somehow hide a 5-ton weapon. But that's how paranoid they were about keeping this secret. At 2:45 in the morning on August the 6th, the Enola Gay took off. 2 other B-29s went with them, one to take scientific measurements, one to photograph what was about to happen. The flight to Hiroshima took about 6 hours. Now try to imagine this from the crew's perspective. You're flying through the night over the Pacific Ocean. You know you've got something important in the bomb bay. Navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk is plotting your course. Co-pilot Robert Lewis is helping fly the plane. Bombardier Thomas Farabee is preparing for the bomb drop. And you're probably thinking, okay, another mission, another bomb, let's do our jobs and get home safe. Around 8:15 a.m., Japanese time, they reached Hiroshima. The weather was clear. Perfect bombing conditions. Tibbets handed control to Farabee, the bombardier. Farabee lined up his target, the Aioi Bridge in the center of the city. At exactly 8:15 and 17 seconds, he released Little Boy. The plane immediately went into a sharp diving turn. This was the maneuver they'd practiced over and over. Get away as fast as possible. The bomb was set to detonate about 900 feet above the city for maximum destruction, and then it happened. At 8:16 a.m., Little Boy exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The crew saw a flash of light brighter than the sun. Then came the mushroom cloud, this massive, boiling black cloud that rose up and literally consumed the city below them. In an instant, over 60% of Hiroshima was leveled, gone. A massive firestorm engulfed everything that was left standing. And this was the moment. This was when it hit the crew members who didn't know. This wasn't just another bomb. This was something else entirely. Even though they'd flown miles away, the shock wave from the blast caught up to the plane. The entire aircraft jolted like a giant hand had slapped it. Tail gunner Robert Karen was looking out the back window and he started yelling, "Look at that, look at that, look at that." Navigator Dutch Van Kirk said later that he did not know the destructive force of what they'd just dropped until that exact moment. He'd been flying bombing missions throughout the war. He'd seen destruction before, but this was different. And then there's co-pilot Robert Lewis. He's watching this mushroom cloud rise up from where a city used to be. And he grabs his flight log. He scribbles down one of the most famous lines in military history. "My God, what have we done?" Think about that line for a second. The sudden realization, the shock, the weight of understanding that you just changed the entire world forever, and you didn't even know the full story until you watched it happen with your own eyes. How would you feel in that moment? Seriously, put yourself there. You thought you were doing your duty, flying another mission, and then you see that. What would be going through your head? Let me know in the comments. The flight back to Tinian took 8 hours. The crew was mostly silent. They were in shock, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. When they landed back at base, they were greeted as heroes, cheering crowds, backslaps. Someone broke out cold beer. There was even a spontaneous jitterbug dance celebration. But the crew members themselves, they had very different reactions to what they'd just done. Paul Tibbets, the pilot, never had any regrets. He believed until the day he died that dropping the bomb saved lives by preventing a land invasion of Japan. He said he slept soundly that night and had zero doubts. Tibbets lived to age 92, and he actually requested no headstone for his grave, probably to avoid controversy. Thomas Farabee, the bombardier who physically released the bomb, was matter-of-fact about it. He said he just pushed the button and did his job. But he also said the world should remember what just one bomb did, so it would never happen again. Dutch Van Kirk believed the bombing was necessary. He later said, "I honestly believe the use of the atomic bomb saved lives in the long run. Most of the lives saved were Japanese. But Robert Lewis, the guy who wrote, 'My God, what have we done?' he struggled with it. He said he was proud to serve his country, but he hoped no one would ever have to witness that sight again." The thing about Hiroshima, it didn't just end World War II. It opened the nuclear age, and we're still living in it today. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. The war was over, but just 4 years later, the Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb. The arms race was on. Both superpowers started building bigger bombs, hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than Little Boy. The world entered the Cold War, living under constant threat of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought us terrifyingly close to the edge. But here's something interesting. Since August 9th, 1945, when Nagasaki was bombed, no nuclear weapon has been used in war. Over 75 years and counting. Many historians think the world looked at what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and collectively said, "Never again." So that's the story of the crew who didn't know they were changing history. Most of the men on the Enola Gay thought they were on just another mission. What they actually did was unleash a force that reshaped human civilization If you found this story as shocking as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories from World War II.